Imagine a worldview, an artistic movement of both the physical and literary forms, and an encompassing philosophy designed to be purely subjective and perhaps for subjectivism's sake. One which offers no valid critique and thus no valid way to form any traditional is-ought question. Well, it's postmodernism. Ah yes, postmodernism, the challenging of conventions, a tradition which prides itself on the dismantling, the deconstruction of any such concept like that of tradition. It's horribly dull, but I figured I'd offer my analysis and critique, and make the case that I believe it to be one of the most poisonous philosophies ever to have plagued the Western world. So, put on your turtleneck, your beret, and don't forget your shades. Che Guevara posters or Andy Warhol paintings are indeed optional. And let's challenge the conventions of that which challenges the conventions of challenging conventions, man. Please bear in mind, a little disclaimer if you will, this video will indeed overgeneralize and oversimplify a lot of the core concepts and principles that make up postmodernism. It turns out a subjective worldview isn't easy to really explore. I know, what a novel concept, but I will of course provide my sources and offer my encouragement in exploring these concepts yourself. Unless you don't want to. I wouldn't really blame you there. What follows is a brief history of the formation and foundations upon which postmodernist thought was built. And one can hardly analyze postmodernism without mentioning the modernism it supposedly succeeds. Generally divided into three distinct iterations: early modernity, classical modernism, and late modernism. Early modernism has its roots in the most significant period in political history. I am of course referring to the Enlightenment. I've not done a lot of videos on the Enlightenment, but my video on classical liberalism will be linked in the description below. Modernism, and by extension postmodernism, is a reaction to the Enlightenment, with the Enlightenment itself considered the premier building block of the early modern age. The early modern age was a time of progress and prosperity. It was the promise of an end to the Dark Ages, institutions like that of feudalism and serfdom. Education, once held under monopoly, was buckling under innovation. Slogans like that of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or liberté, égalité, and fraternité, gave rise to the attitudes of optimism and hope. It gave us liberalism, and even gave rise to the very concept of a nation-state. It gave us the origins of capitalism, innovation, the power of reason, and rational thought, and these things in turn gave birth to the modernist movement, an optimistic worldview. Excelsior incarnate, ever upwards. Such were the optimistic tones of modernism that shaped our present day. Societal institutions were progressing so rapidly, it seemed as though humanity was nearing a finish line, unseen for most of our history. This was the birth of classical modernism. Now, aesthetically speaking, modernism as an art form in particular succeeds romanticism and realism in art, the neoclassical or Augustan architectural art forms, and everything from literature to other artistic traditions. And it really made its bones as a movement in challenging these conventions without destroying them, rather building upon them through new perspectives. Postmodernism, by contrast, is known for its most deconstructivist approach. More on that soon. Modernism rests upon a great many pillars, particularly upon the pursuit of knowledge, progress, and other such Enlightenment ideals. It is a worldview that came about at the latter end of the 18th century, a time in which science prevailed, providing effective treatment to and even curing diseases, which once threatened great swaths of people. Coupled with the discovery of things like that of Newtonian physics, thermodynamics, the combustion engine, and just more and more advanced technology. I mean, simply take a look at the technological advancement from the Enlightenment that inspired such modernistic attitudes. For centuries, up until the modern era, and I mean long spans of human history, times in which cart and horse were the only means of transport, dating back all the way to antiquity, only to see in the span of a single century the advent of the train, the automobile, and, not long after, on to the plane and the rocket. Such rapid development would of course give way to an attitude of excitement and unprecedented optimism. And I mean, on the subject of modernism, you really can't say optimism enough. The glass was certainly half full, if not overflowing. These attitudes led to many differing philosophical perspectives and ideologies, and this, of course, led to many forms of modernistic hubris, giving way to late modernism. And, as that hopeful worldview suggests, modernists believed humanity was at the very precipice of utopia, that unforeseen finish line. It was just a matter of finalizing humanity's progress, attitudes just as cultivated by urbanization and industrialization, and an overarching obsession with progress and the desire for the discovery of universal truth. The very thought that the world, and thus society as it is, was created by humanity's progress, rather than the other way around. The later modernistic interpretations of industrialization are now remembered as the consumerism of the mid-20th century, a time in which products were presented to the masses as solutions to every single problem. Some of the fantasies of modernism are now known to us as retrofuturism, an optimistic notion that presented the future as a period in which the cultural values established in the mid-20th century still prevailed, and the technology maintained similar motifs. Other modernist interpretations and fantasies became the ideologies that made the 20th century perhaps the bloodiest in human history. Well, if you don't count ancient China. Anyway, these ideologies, such as socialism, communism, fascism, and all of the sub-ideologies that fall under these umbrella terms, were all results of the wider modernistic worldview, with their own distinct philosophies on how to achieve such progress. This hubris would bring modernism to its knees. Modernism once held that humanity was close to achieving a utopian existence, but many disagreed on how that progress ought to be achieved. Later iterations of modernism were founded upon that aforementioned hubris. Unlike earlier forms, late modernism shares much in common with postmodernism, particularly with the philosophical sanction of breaking with tradition rather than building upon it with innovation. Postmodernism was born from the cynicism that followed the ruins of the Second World War, a philosophical sentiment which capitalized on the promises of modernism having been unfulfilled or even false to begin with. As we know now, humanity ultimately didn't achieve utopia through communism, fascism, or anything else modernism seemingly offered. Rather, the result of such technological innovation was death and destruction. Sure, medicine had progressed, but there was no cure to the pestilence of war, violence, and human suffering. Sure, the Enlightenment brought about the official end of feudalism, and by extension an end to the time where birthright and hierarchy determined societal prosperity. But did it end inequality? To the burgeoning postmodernist movement, perhaps life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was all a grand lie. And this is where the deconstructivist and relative worldviews of postmodernism began to take shape, as perhaps what needed to be broken apart were the ideas behind modernism and the Enlightenment altogether. From the second half of the 20th century onwards, the postmodernist movement blossomed, or rather more fittingly festered, as discontent and cynicism formed the first foundations of the philosophies behind postmodernism. Whereas modernism was characterized by a thirst for universal or objective truth, the challenging of ideas in the interest of building upon them, and an overlaying attitude of optimism. But all of that is held by postmodernists to mean that the only ones that enjoyed the naive narratives of modernity were rich, white, heterosexual men. Yeah. That's modernism, and postmodernism is in essence the opposite, the antithesis, so to speak. The wider philosophy holds that there is no universal truth, only offering the relativist view of subjective truths. However, the most commonly accepted pillars upon which postmodernism stands are actually quite simple. It's only when you analyze them further that it becomes a bit bizarre. It challenges ideas in the interests of deconstructivism, building upon nothing at all. There's a, quote, rejection of meta-narratives and the embracing of mini-narratives, along with ideas that humanity is influenced by social constructs rather than the other way around. I know it's all rather chicken and egg, but we'll get into all of this when I go into the thinkers behind postmodernism. And, of course, an overlaying attitude of pessimism. I mean, look no further than the title itself. Just as the term modern is synonymous with concurrent or contemporary, postmodernism carries an underlying meaning of pure pessimism, that a proverbial golden age, as it were, had not only ended, but may not have been so wonderful to begin with. After all, nothing happens in post, and there is no reaching the future. That should be quite telling when it comes to the wider worldview. The only thing that modernism and postmodernism share in common is the challenging of the Enlightenment's ideas, and in my own view, though admittedly biased, one builds and one destroys. I can, however, see where some elements of postmodernism are coming from. After all, later iterations of modernism believed that progress was nearing an end. It was diluted by hubristic fantasies, and it's little wonder why such a movement came about to challenge it. And these fantasies are largely symptomatic of what I believe to be the most damaging of misconceptions in our age. This unfounded conclusion that humanity's progress is just around the corner, and that any notion of utopia is at hand. It's not, and it never will be, because progress, like time, isn't cyclical, it's linear. Humanity's progress only ends along with humanity's existence. Now, the key questions here are, when did postmodernism come about, and what exactly defines it? Well, that's tricky. I won't be able to offer a linear video structure as I could with modernism. And just as I said at the beginning, that's because it's quite difficult to pinpoint that, as it's a subjective worldview. Even postmodernists often disagree with one another on the very definitions of the wider philosophy. In fact, the only thing in my experience that unite postmodernists is that they all often say, "You're missing the point, that's not postmodernism," when the very point of it all is being open to interpretation. And that's by its very nature, it's relativist, and that's kind of the big idea. As to when it came about, most pinpoint the movement as having arisen around the late 1960s to sometime in the 1970s, and some sources suggest the theory arose long before that. Let's just take the former timeline for granted, and of it, one thing is indeed for certain. It has plagued universities, art forms, architecture, schools of thought, and various other social and cultural institutions across the world ever since. And as to the definition, Encyclopedia Britannica defines it as a reaction against philosophical assumptions and values of the modern period of Western, specifically European, history. You see, philosophical movements typically value clarity, and postmodernism tends to embrace abstract banalities masked as ideas of substance. A postmodernist would likely refute Encyclopedia Britannica's definition, offering an excuse to the effect of, actually, to define something in such rigid terms is counterproductive to the aims of challenging Eurocentric thinking, and thus their definitions of truth. Ask yourself, define definition, man. Okay, I'm somewhat of an impressionist, but this was my carefully crafted interpretation of the common postmodernist word salad, and though it may seem like a straw man, it's nonsensical. And the best examples of this can be found amongst the works of those aforementioned key thinkers that we can analyze, who are credited with the most widely accepted theories that define postmodernism, the most predominant of which are the French intellectuals of the mid to late 20th century. Thinkers like Jean-François Lyotard, Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida are amongst the most prominent, the postmodernist poster children, as it were, although there were and are many other figures that spearheaded the movement, as we know it today. In fact, I myself was introduced to postmodernism particularly as it pertains to literature through the works of American novelist John Barth. You might know him for his magnum opus, Lost in the Funhouse. I recall forcing myself to get through the dense pages of that aforementioned nonsensical word salad, all the while being told that what I was reading was a work of art. In reality, I was thinking to myself how exhausted Western literature must be if this passes for art. I was then promptly told that that was simply what I had read into it, and that it was by Barth's own design that I formed such an opinion. Anyway, now, when it comes to French intellectuals, their story begins in the May of 1968. The student protests were initially anti-authoritarian in nature, except in the middle of the riots the rhetoric became complicated. Soon the definitions became blurred, and what was or wasn't actually authoritarian was obscured. More on that soon, but history would ultimately show us that they themselves became authoritarian in their own right over time. Oh well, at least they tried. Now, to really set the scene here, the economy was in ruins. Universities were overcrowded, underfunded, and highly regulated. The government of Charles de Gaulle had been backwards, fighting tooth and nail to preserve a status quo that had been destroyed about 2 republics ago, and thus had been slow to repair a country still scarred by the Second World War. Anyway, add overly skeptical, cynical people who reek of pretentiousness that tell nobody that even asked that they're totally deep counterculturalists, and you've got quite the recipe. Anyway, as it was the 1960s, the key points to the protests were things like governmental reform, social liberation, the sexual revolution, and intellectual freedom. 60s stuff. But it slowly became a riot led by a Marxist-anarchist quagmire, and of these thinkers, of course with Marxist sympathies, were Lyotard, Foucault, and Derrida. And this turmoil and destruction inspired them to spearhead another philosophical movement which embraced such destruction. With the historical context out of the way, let's dive on in. The Marxist French intellectuals presented several theories about the failures of modernism. Even Marxism wasn't without scrutiny. Sorry, J-Pete's, postmodernism and Marxism are not, strictly speaking, the same, though they are equally cancerous. These particular theories would become the framework for postmodernist thought. Now it just simply needed to be applied. Let's have a look. Jean-François Lyotard was born in the August of 1924 in Versailles to a salesman and a homemaker. Little Jean-François wanted to be a monk, or a historian, or a writer, ultimately failing at the latter and deciding to call it quits. He'd serve in the French resistance during the Second World War and later study philosophy. He'd demonstrate his growing detachment from reality by joining a Marxist group dubbed Socialisme ou Barbarie, or translated as Socialism or Barbarism, which itself was dedicated to refuting Trotskyist doctrines as insufficient to the wider Marxist movement. So, whenever a present-day Marxist makes the classic remark, "No, that wasn't real communism," we can possibly point to Lyotard as the originator of such an assertion. Anyway, his philosophical works would be centered in far-left political theory until 1979. When his work, The Postmodern Condition, would be responsible for the rejection of grand narratives, or rather the attitudes of total skepticism postmodernism is known for today. Jean-François Lyotard rejected the idea of meta-narratives, which, if you are unfamiliar with the term, are essentially comprehensive accounts which explain knowledge, experience, etc. For example, historical accounts, philosophies, religions. These are all examples of meta-narratives. Lyotard denies the existence of such, and advocated instead for what he called mini-narratives. In short, this is relativism, or subjectivism, whichever floats your proverbial boat, and it holds that there is no such thing as an objective or universal truth, only interpretations. Live your truth, and so on. Now, Lyotard's claim to fame at the top of the postmodernist movement is simple. As I said of these three earlier, we find from them the most accepted definitions of postmodernism. He posits in his most influential and aforementioned work, The Postmodern Condition, that the definition of postmodernism is an incredulity towards meta-narratives. In short, you can take that to mean that nothing is really true. Nothing really exists outside of personally lived experiences. Instead of a healthy skepticism, we begin to see here an unhealthy obsession with skepticism. As to the concept of mini-narratives, Lyotard holds that unlike meta-narratives, there is no overarching story to humanity, no objective way to grasp history, or any knowledge for that matter. Rather, any understanding of the world comes from local, contingent, and contextual stories that explain smaller, personal, or group-specific experiences, rather than universal truths or empirical evidence. And if that isn't foreshadowing the state of the current culture today, I don't know what is. Now, mind you, Lyotard even holds phenomena that can't exist without empirical evidence as meta-narratives. You know, things like science. Yeah, that's subjective too, apparently. And even more annoying to me as a linguistics student, apparently so is language, as Lyotard also believed that language wasn't able to provide coherent understanding of wider concepts. I won't even get into that, but I do understand his frustrations at the limits of language when trying to describe abstract concepts. Anyway, Lyotard's philosophical method has been so widely adopted by the postmodernist movement as it appears today, with his rejection of meta-narratives itself becoming a meta-narrative. But take one example on how his methods are applied today, in which marginalized groups and their experiences are often valued as inherently more valid simply on the basis that it is a marginalized perspective. Lyotard could be the subject of a video all on its own. I mean, he won't, but he could. Michel Foucault, Marxist French intellectual and champion of countless Christopher Lloyd look-alike competitions. He also shares many philosophical similarities to Lyotard, and is thus another key thinker as it pertains to postmodernism. Foucault, much to his own disdain, was born in 1926, born very, very rich. His father was a surgeon, as was his father before him. Yes, Dr. Paul Foucault was a doting father, making sure that his son would be well educated and developed, giving him a comfortable life with enough personal agency to do whatever he really wanted. So of course Michel hated him and everything he represented. He often tried to hide his privileged past from the press, and by extension, other Marxists in his earlier intellectual circles. Of course he did. In his personal life, he was a gay man, and had an obsession with artistic depictions of torture, and an affinity for sadomasochism. He felt marginalized, embittered, and unable to express his sexuality. In France? Yeah, in France of all places he didn't feel sexually liberated enough. Well, there actually might be a reason for that. Anyway, Foucault saw himself as a misunderstood genius, a historian, or rather, in his own words, an archaeologist, as he felt his historical work was significant purely because he saw himself as having dug up forgotten histories. Similar to Lyotard, he rejected meta-narratives, albeit in a more historical lens. In his work, Michel Foucault theorized that all humanity suffers from a power dynamic, and thus is the reason behind the postmodernist attitudes towards seeing everything as an oppressor versus oppressed dynamic, from gender, sexuality, culture, etc. In fact, sex would obviously play a major role in his work. Of his major works, he saw knowledge as it was to be obstructed by meta-narratives, that truth was constructed by social factors, and that all of history is, of course, relative. It stands to reason that he supposes that if you cannot live life through a victim's lens, then you cannot truly know. And if I sound dismissive, it's because we're short on time and Foucault is quite a weighty subject. Also because I am. In short, history is relative, language is a framework of power, and truth is contingent upon a given society. So if you claim to know reality, you are in fact exercising power over weaker people. Something he knows a lot about. For those who subscribe to Foucault's drivel, if you proclaim yourself an individual, you are only able to do so if you are able to exercise privilege over groups. In essence, he believed individual agency non-existent. Other factors were, of course, sexuality and race. That also impacted your value as an individual and was thus a key component to your identity, for some reason. Anyway, we're strapped for time, and I'm condensing quite a lot of information about his work. Michel Foucault would ultimately die in 1984, sadly another casualty of the AIDS crisis. Years after, however, a contemporary of his made light of some very heinous stuff. You see, Michel Foucault loved French Tunisia. He was a man of the children, and not predatory in any way. He simply, and very innocently, advocated for the abolition of the age of consent. After all, morals are just relative abstractions anyway. Guy Sorman recounts events a bit differently. Foucault is remembered in Tunisia as a prolific predator. Remember when I said he didn't find France liberating enough? In Tunisia, he could get away with it. The guy who wanted to dismantle colonialism ended up using it to his advantage as a Frenchman. Michel Foucault is currently the most cited so-called intellectual in college sources across the Western world. And if you don't think that's a problem, then I'm very curious as to why you're still watching. Some will defend him as a flawed man, but nonetheless profound. He could make for the subject of his own video, and I might delve deeper, but I hold him to have been one of the worst things to have ever happened to higher education. Jacques Derrida, the man behind deconstructivism. Born in 1930 in French Algeria, his work spans philosophy, literature, linguistics, and politics, challenging traditional Western metaphysics, including ideas about meaning, identity, and truth. You may have noticed a common theme here. Postmodernism is all about deconstructing the truth, and this is quite telling when analyzing them. They have no sense of reality. He famously said, "There is no outside text," essentially meaning that words have no direct meaning. Everything is up for interpretation, and even authors hold no control over how their writings are interpreted. He stands out a bit as he is more philosophical rather than political, like the last two, and Lyotard famously hated him. Anyway, deconstructivism is Derrida's method of breaking down traditional ideas. It focuses on exposing hidden contradictions and assumptions in texts. He argued that Western thought is essentially based upon contradiction, and that there is always favoritism for the privileged over the underprivileged. Again, it's just the oppressor versus oppressed shtick that litters most postmodernist thought. Derrida criticized the Western focus on logos, meaning logic or reason, and of course he did. And his ramblings are now worshipped by college professors and students the world over. Another way in which we see this is through his opposition to binaries, claiming everything is on a spectrum, and this ranges from gender, identity, society, etc. And with his dismissal of basic linguistic concepts and by extension the very function of language itself, he posits the non-existence of speaker intention, that is, how we construct sentences and how we mean them to come across. Let me give you an example. Say we're both in the same room, and I say, "Hey, it's kinda cold, right?" And you respond with, "What the hell are you doing in my house?" Okay, no, I'm sorry. Say we're both in the same room, and I say, "Hey, it's kinda cold in here, right?" Pragmatic linguistics holds that you can interpret this as my asking you to, say, shut the window or turn on the heater. Derrida believes this paradigm doesn't exist, and my intention doesn't matter, only your interpretation. A postmodernist would probably respond to my complaint with, "Actually, I heard pneumonia is very good for your lungs, don't be temperaturist." Anyhow, given his belief in the meaninglessness of language, it's a wonder why anyone listened to him. By his own laughable reasoning, his words mean nothing, and at least there I find agreement. Anyway, as most of his work focuses on the metaphysical, I'll just leave it at that. Today, postmodernists tend to regurgitate the nonsense I laid out before you. After examining the originators of such a worldview, let us now quickly examine how those ideas have been applied today. Postmodernism has completely infected the social sciences, rendering these schools of thought impotent, offering nothing of any real value. And if you find the present day growing increasingly absurd, it is because this was the intellectual infection that gave us identity politics, countless meaningless theories, and studies that do nothing but waste our time. And in the interests of time, I'll just show you examples of its applications from the faces of postmodernism today, such as the works of Judith Butler, so-called philosopher and gender studies scholar. Her most notable idea is that of gender performance, in which she posits the definitions of gender are outdated and thus relative.
We are rattling to the core heteronormative family structures. We are rattling them to the core. What they have to lose is the belief in their supremacy.
And then there's Kimberly Crenshaw and her theories of intersectionality, which holds that people's identities are shaped by the intersection of various social categories like race, gender, and class, which interact to produce unique experiences of oppression. In essence, if you're black, you're oppressed. If you're a woman who's black, doubly oppressed, and so on. She's also a contributor of critical race theory. I won't get into that.
Of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice.
Then there's Julia Kristeva, whose theories of the abject and psychoanalytic feminism focus on oppression through patriarchal structures and so on. Anyway, let's talk about postmodern art. Whenever you hear someone criticizing modern art and its stupidity, it stands to reason they're actually referring to postmodern art exhibits, which are of course ridiculous art pieces masquerading as profound social commentary. I'm not much of an art critic. In fact, I don't think many things in life are subjective, but taste in art just might be. In fact, postmodern art pieces would probably be okay for home decor, but as an actual artistic celebration, not so much. I myself am an enjoyer of the sublime. That's neither here nor there. I do have a passion for literature, however. Most of my hobbies revolve around it in some way or another, and I pride myself on having a collection of various works. But there are postmodernist authors that might give us a little more insight as to the postmodernist worldview. After all, you may have noticed that Lyotard, Foucault, and Derrida were largely saying the same thing. Authors of the tradition tend to apply their nonsense in their work. This typically occurs in breaking with tradition, challenging old conventions, and trying to be edgy, raunchy, shocking, and original. The aforementioned John Barth did this to a degree, hiding narratives within narratives to create what essentially amounts to vomit in the written form. Similar to Barth is Donald Barthelme, best known for his work The Dead Father. Aside from sounding like an Elder Scrolls side quest, the plot revolves around a giant creature being dragged around by its children across a wasteland while rambling about symbolism the whole time. I'm not making that up. There is, however, another author, and for once it's a postmodernist that I actually kinda sorta respect. I couldn't discuss postmodernism without bringing him up. Gore Vidal. His work was raunchy, and he was quite an individual. If you know anything about the man, you'll know he's impossible to classify, and that's true of his work as well. And while I hold most of his ideas to be disagreeable, and the man himself, though fascinating, to be a bit of an arrogant contrarian, some of his ideas did have some substance. He, like all postmodernists, break with traditions, but his style sets him apart from the rest. He famously believed that there are no heterosexual or homosexual people. Rather, These are the adjectives that describe the acts themselves. He also said that we are all prostitutes in one way or another because we often need to sell ourselves to the highest bidder, citing college degrees, skills, and other traits as proof that we constantly try to appreciate and value for a better tomorrow. And a lot of these untraditional ideas do ring of truth, at least to some degree. And whereas all second or third generation postmodern writers have become banal and unoriginal, Vidal's work remains a bit of an enigma. Both postmodernist and yet somehow just Vidal's. So, this was postmodernism, an amalgamation of deconstruction which proposes nothing. A brutal form of pessimism that builds nothing nor contributes anything to human progress. It is regression, and thus what I consider to be poison of the mind. A worldview that became self-cannibalistic, that which set out to dismantle what it perceived as rigid social structures has now itself become a rigid social structure. Now attempting to govern how we think, act, and speak, it became the very thing it reacted against, endlessly spiraling into a pluralistic mush. Postmodernism is a celebration of the perceived failures that gave rise to it. This celebration of mediocrity attacks modernistic thinking and has festered within liberalism, creating a schism between those once proud liberals, now labeled conservatives, as postmodernist thought breaks its leash and feasts upon everything in its path indiscriminately, corrupting what was once heralded as the values of liberalism, now casting it aside in favor of what amounts to a cultural black hole. So, what has the reaction against postmodernism been? That's a tricky question, and one that I ultimately have no solid answer for, as the intellectual catastrophe we see before us is still ongoing. In recent years, metamodernism and neo-modernism have come about, and while there's no time to discuss those, equally worth note are the thinkers that have called postmodernism out on its trash philosophy, namely Stephen Hicks, Alan Sokal, Noam Chomsky, and that's just naming a few. Of course, we all know Jordan Peterson, who finds postmodernism just bloody awful. Alan Sokal, in his work Fashionable Nonsense, illustrates the madness of postmodernism and its abuse of science, writing, "There is something very odd indeed in the belief that in looking, say, for causal laws or a unified theory, or in asking whether atoms really do obey the laws of quantum mechanics, the activities of scientists are somehow inherently bourgeois, or Eurocentric, or masculinist, or even militaristic." Then there's Noam Chomsky, whom I respect as a linguist but largely dismiss as a political philosopher. He does make a valid critique of postmodernism in its obscurantism and rejection of objective reality. He argues that postmodernism's dense, jargon-filled language makes it inaccessible and detached from real-world issues. And of course, in a series of lectures, philosopher Stephen Hicks views postmodernism as a reactionary movement against the successes of the Enlightenment, replacing reason and truth with power and subjective will. Aside from these examples, most of the reactions against postmodernism propose merely a return to modernism, and this would not work. And in my own humble opinion, here's why. As I said earlier, late modernism was plagued by hubris, and this was obviously the catalyst for postmodernism. And what postmodernism has effectively done has made everything so damn meaningless. It is one thing to constructively critique history and the narratives behind our societies, but it is another thing entirely to dismiss it for the sake of dismissal. Today, new generations find themselves grasping for purpose, and as a result, we see the interest in late modernistic hubris has become renewed, perhaps as defiance against postmodernism, but this leads us to the precipice of yet another vicious circle. We live in an era in which the left-right political paradigm has adopted the postmodernist playbook, fighting fire with fire in the form of identity politics, without any real progression and thus contributing to cultural rot. Or perhaps it could be argued that modernism never failed. It was the hubris of believing progress had met its end, and that it was a matter of tying up loose ends that ultimately hindered progress. What is to be done? Well, I don't know. But I do feel there is another worldview that has proven to be timeless. The Enlightenment, or early modernity, showed us what humanity is capable of. The great strides we took that we have long since abandoned. A fire waiting to be rekindled, and a freedom that makes life worth living and brings beauty back to it. Now, I don't mean to preach my biases at you, dear viewer, but I revere the power of knowledge, and I hope you do too. And if there's any reason in my covering this topic, I simply found it fascinating that such a cancerous view of reality is so widely celebrated. This pseudo-intellectual rationalization of narcissism and the pursuit of power over others while masquerading as liberation. Oh well. As for you, dear viewer, I know what you're probably thinking. Dude, chill out. And I know I'm very passionate. I know this isn't my usual choice of topic, and I don't mean to make this channel inconsistent. But I felt compelled to present this topic, particularly as I analyzed the current state of Western culture. However, one thing about myself does remain consistent. I am but a man with an immense passion for the progress of the human condition and all of the beauty that would encompass. Anyway, I know I've condensed a lot of information in this video. It was pretty much just me complaining into my microphone. And I'll delve into these topics in later videos, but trust me, it's not a priority. Remember to share your thoughts in the comments below. Feel free to defend or condemn postmodernism to your heart's content, or just share your opinion on this video. Only bear one thing in mind when you do so. This has been the Minarchist. Keep your head on a swivel. It's a big, big world out there. And another thing about Eurocentric belief systems, I just read The Dead Father, and let me tell you, it was deep, man. It was really deep. And you know what else is deep? This poem I wrote on the way here.